buttoning my coat when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. My notary, Sandra. We'd worked together twice before, once when I refinanced my condo, once when my dad needed documents witnessed after his first stroke. She was methodical, quiet, the kind of woman who double-checked every signature twice and never called unless something was wrong. The text said, "Do not sign anything today. Call me first. Please." I stood there with one button still undone, staring at those words. My brother had texted me 20 minutes earlier, reminding me to be at his house by 11. We were supposed to be finalizing the paperwork for our dad's bakery, the one Dad had built from nothing, over 32 years. The one that still smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar every time I walked through the door, the one he'd left to both of us when he died 4 months ago. I called Sandra back immediately. She picked up on the first ring. Let me back up. My dad, Robert, opened Halverson's Bakery in 1991 in a small strip mall in Dayton, Ohio. He started with one display case, a rented mixer, and a recipe for apple fritters that his mother had written on the back of a church bulletin. By the time I was in middle school, he had 12 employees and a second location. By the time he retired, partially because he never really stopped going in, Halverson's had 3 locations and a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocery chains. My brother Ethan is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one Dad took on early morning supply runs, the one who learned the books at 16, the one who everyone assumed would take over one day. I went to college in Columbus, got a degree in communications, spent my 20s working in marketing for a mid-sized healthcare company. I loved the bakery the way you love a childhood home, deeply, but from a comfortable distance. Dad had his first stroke when I was 28. Minor, they said. He recovered well. He kept going in 3 days a week, mostly to sit at the corner table near the window and drink coffee and watch his employees work. We all pretended that was normal. I think it made him happy to pretend too. His second stroke happened on a Tuesday morning 18 months later. He was at home. He survived, but his left side never came back fully, and his speech got slower, more effortful. He moved in with Ethan and Ethan's wife Brooke that spring. Their house was bigger, they had a spare room on the ground floor, and it made practical sense. I drove up from Columbus every other weekend. We'd watch old game shows together, and he'd tell me the same stories about the early days of the bakery, and I'd listen like it was the first time every single time. He died in September. Heart failure, sudden, at home. He was 67. The will was straightforward. The bakery, all 3 locations, the equipment, the wholesale contracts, the brand, split equally between Ethan and me. His house, his savings, his personal belongings divided the same way. I remember sitting in the attorney's office and feeling nothing but numb. I wasn't surprised by the terms. Dad had told me years ago that's what he planned. Equal. Always equal. What I didn't know, what none of us talked about in those first weeks, was what equal was actually going to mean when one person lived 10 minutes from the bakery and the other person lived 2 hours away. Ethan started calling in October. At first it was updates. The wholesale contract was up for renewal. One of the managers at the Kettering location had put in her notice. The ovens at the original location were getting old. Normal stuff. I'd listen, offer opinions when I had them, and mostly defer to his judgment because he knew the day-to-day better than I did. Then in November, he started talking about selling. Not all of it, just the 2 newer locations, he said. Consolidate. Focus on the original. Make it more manageable. The offer was already on the table. A regional bakery group out of Cincinnati that was expanding. They wanted turnkey operations, and Ethan had been in preliminary conversations with them for a few weeks. I said I wanted to see the numbers before we made any decisions. He said of course. He'd have everything ready by the holidays. The holidays came and went. I asked twice more. Each time he said he was working on it, it was complicated, he'd have it to me soon. I drove up for Christmas, and we didn't talk about it at all, which I told myself was fine, because it was Christmas and Dad had just died 3 months before, and we were all still figuring out how to be a family without him at the center of it. In January, Brooke texted me a photo of my dad's recipe binder, the original one, the one he'd kept behind a counter for 30 years, and said she'd found a good place for it in their living room. I thought that was a little strange. That binder had always lived at the bakery. But I didn't say anything. In February, Ethan called and said the buyers were getting impatient. They needed an answer. He'd had a preliminary purchase agreement drawn up, just to show good faith, and he needed me to come up and sign it. Just preliminary, he said. Nothing binding. Just to keep the deal alive while we finalize the details. I said I'd come up on the Saturday after Valentine's Day. And then Sandra texted me. I called her back standing in my kitchen with my coat half buttoned and my keys already in my hand. She spoke carefully. She told me she'd been contacted 2 weeks earlier by a notary service that was filing an inquiry with the county, a routine audit of recent real estate and business transfer documents. During the review, her name had come up. On a document she had never seen, a power of attorney dated 8 months ago, apparently executed while my father was still alive, that named Ethan as sole authorized agent for all decisions related to Halverson's Bakery and its associated properties. The document had her stamp on it, her stamp, not her signature, not her presence. Her stamp, which she kept in a lockbox in her home office. She had notarized that document. She had not been present when it was signed. She had never seen it before the audit flagged it. My father had signed it apparently 6 weeks before he died, during a period when his speech was slow and his mobility was limited and he was living in my brother's house. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I didn't plan to. My legs just stopped working. I asked her what it meant. She said it meant that if I had walked into my brother's house that morning and signed a preliminary purchase agreement, I would have been signing as a co-owner of a business that, according to a fraudulent power of attorney, Ethan already had unilateral authority over. The preliminary agreement wouldn't have been preliminary at all. In Ohio, with that POA in place, he could have argued I'd ratified the entire sales structure. The deal could have closed without any further input from me. I would have handed over my half of 32 years of my father's life for whatever number Ethan had already negotiated. I asked her one more question. I asked if she had already reported this. She said she was waiting for my call first. I told her to go ahead. I didn't drive to Ethan's house that morning. I sat on my kitchen floor for about 10 minutes. Then I got up, made coffee, and called an attorney. Not the family estate attorney. A different one. One a friend from work had used for a business dispute 2 years earlier. I explained the situation in as much detail as I could. She asked me to come in Monday morning and to bring every document I had related to the estate and the bakery. I texted Ethan. Something came up. Can we reschedule? He replied within 2 minutes. Everything okay? I said yes. Just a conflict with work. He said no problem. How about the following Saturday? And I said sure. I didn't sleep much that weekend. On Monday, I sat across from my attorney, Hannah, and spread every document I had across her conference table. The will. The estate inventory. The emails Ethan had sent about the sale. The preliminary purchase agreement he'd forwarded, which I'd never signed, but had printed out just in case. Hannah looked at the purchase agreement for a long time without saying anything. Then she turned it around and pointed to a clause on page 3. A clause that defined authorized seller as the holder of any valid power of attorney executed by either owner in the prior 12 months. The POA was dated 10 months ago. If that POA was legitimate, Ethan didn't need my signature at all. But getting my signature would have made any legal challenge almost impossible. If I'd signed that Saturday, I would have been a co-seller on record, and the fraud would have been buried under my name. That clause did not appear in the original draft of the purchase agreement Ethan had described to me in our phone calls. Someone had added it. Hannah said, "Do you have any idea when he started planning this?" I thought about the recipe binder in Brooke's living room. I thought about the way Ethan had kept delaying sending me the financials. I thought about Christmas, how he'd hugged me a little too long when I left, like he felt guilty about something. Or maybe like he was saying goodbye to a version of our relationship that was about to end. I said I didn't know, but I thought it had probably been a while. What came out over the next 6 weeks was worse than I'd expected, and I'd already expected something bad. The POA had been executed in August, 6 weeks before Dad died, during a stretch when Dad was having what Ethan had described to the rest of us as a good spell. He'd been more alert, more communicative. Ethan had told me during one of our calls that Dad was doing better. What he hadn't told me was that he'd used that window to have documents prepared, brought to the house, and signed. The notary stamp had been stolen. literally taken from Sandra's home office during a charity event she'd hosted in July, where Ethan and Brooke had been guests. The county auditor's inquiry wasn't the only flag. When Hannah subpoenaed the bakery's financial records for the past year, we found that 2 of the wholesale contracts, worth roughly $180,000 annually, had been quietly renegotiated in October, after Dad died, with the renewal commissions redirected to a new LLC. The LLC was registered in Brooke's maiden name. The buyers in Cincinnati, it turned out, knew nothing about the POA. They'd been dealing with Ethan in good faith. When Hannah's letter reached their attorneys explaining that the sale was being contested and that there was an active fraud investigation, they withdrew immediately. I drove up to Dayton for the first time since Christmas on a cold Wednesday in March. Not to see Ethan, but to see the managers at all 3 locations and tell them personally that the bakery was not being sold, that their jobs were secure, and that we were going to figure out a path forward. The manager at the original location, a woman named June who'd been with my dad for 19 years, started crying. She said she'd been sick with worry since October. She said my dad would have hated what was happening. I held it together until I got to my car. Ethan called me the Thursday before the investigators were scheduled to formally question him. I almost didn't pick up. He didn't start with an apology. He started with an explanation that he'd been carrying the bakery alone for 2 years while I lived my comfortable life in Columbus, that he'd watched Dad deteriorate up close every day while I showed up every other weekend with casseroles and left by Sunday afternoon, that he'd done the work and he deserved more than half. I let him talk. When he stopped, I said one thing. I said, "You forged a notary stamp and you used Dad's last good weeks to get him to sign something he didn't understand. That's what you did. And you can call it whatever you want." He hung up. I didn't hear from him again after that. Not directly. Brooke sent me a long text 3 days later saying I was tearing the family apart, that Ethan had sacrificed everything, that I was being vindictive. I read it once and didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. Some texts don't deserve answers. They only deserve silence and documentation, so I screenshot it and forwarded it to Hannah. The investigators found enough. The forged notary stamp, the altered purchase agreement, the LLC, financial records showing transfers in October and November that hadn't been disclosed to the estate. Ethan was charged with forgery, notary fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty as a co-executor of the estate. The DA's office flagged the case for wire fraud as well because some of the contract redirects had crossed state lines. His attorney argued that Dad had understood what he was signing, that the POA was legitimate and Sandra's stamp had simply been borrowed with the intention of returning it. Yes, they actually argued that. Hannah almost laughed in the deposition. Sandra did not laugh. She'd had to file an affidavit explaining that her professional license was tied to that stamp and that its unauthorized use had put her livelihood at risk. The Cincinnati buyers sent a letter through their attorneys expressing that they had acted in good faith and hoped for resolution. We never disputed that. They weren't the problem. The estate attorney, the family one, recused himself once the fraud investigation began. He prepared the will. He hadn't been involved in the POA. He told Hannah privately that he'd had concerns in the fall about some of Ethan's requests and had declined to participate. He hadn't said anything to me because he hadn't been certain. I appreciated the honesty. I was also furious that certainty had been the bar. I kept the bakery, all 3 locations. I'm not in Dayton full-time, that's not realistic, and honestly I think everyone there needed some space from the family drama before they could look at a Halverson and feel normal again. I promoted June to general manager across all 3 locations, with a salary that reflects what she's actually doing. I hired an outside operations consultant to look at the books and the contracts and tell me what was real and what Ethan had been inflating or deflating, depending on which direction served his narrative. The wholesale contracts got sorted. The LLC Brooke had set up was dissolved after the estate clawback. We recovered most of it. I still drive up every few weeks. I still sit at the corner table near the window and drink coffee and watch people work, the same way my dad used to. June always puts a bear claw on the table without asking. It was my dad's usual order. I don't know what Ethan's outcome will be. The case is still moving. His attorney is negotiating. I'm not part of those conversations. That's between him and the DA, and I've made my peace with not controlling that piece of it. What I care about is that the fraud is on record, that Sandra's name is clear, that the bakery is still standing. The hardest part isn't what Ethan did. I mean, it is. It's awful, and I go back and forth between grief and anger depending on the day. He's my brother. I used to call him when I had a bad week. I used to trust him as the person who knew my dad best. All of that is gone now, and I don't know if it comes back. But the hardest part, the thing that keeps me up sometimes, is the timeline. 6 weeks before Dad died. That's when the documents were signed, which means that during those last 6 weeks, when I was driving up on weekends and sitting with Dad and watching game shows and pretending everything was okay, Ethan already knew what he'd done. He sat across from me at that kitchen table every other weekend and watched me say goodbye to our father without telling me that he'd already started building a wall between me and everything Dad had built. I don't know how you come back from knowing that. I don't know if you're supposed to. Sandra sent me a card in April, just a short note saying she was glad the audit had caught it in time and that she hoped things were getting easier. She included a coupon for 10% off notary services, which made me laugh for the first time in what felt like months. I put the card on my refrigerator. I put my dad's recipe binder, the original one, which the investigators recovered from Ethan's house as part of the document review, back on the shelf behind the counter at the original Kettering Road location. That's where it belongs. That's where it's always belonged. Some things have weight, some things have a place that's just theirs, and no one gets to move them no matter how long they thought they were in charge. My dad knew that. He built 32 years on that idea. I'm just trying to hold it. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. When I'm driving up to Dayton on a Friday morning and the highway is empty and I have nothing to do but think, I trace things back. I try to find where it started. And every time, I end up at the same place. Not the forged stamp, not the altered contract, not even the power of attorney. I end up at a choice my brother made somewhere in the middle of 2 hard years, when he decided that resentment was easier than honesty. That's the thing about the way actions compound over time. Ethan didn't wake up one morning and decide to commit fraud. He woke up one morning feeling underappreciated, and he let that feeling sit. And then he let it sit some more. And somewhere along the way, the feeling became a justification, and the justification became a plan, and the plan required a stolen notary stamp and a forged document and 6 weeks of sitting across from me at a kitchen table while our dad was dying, pretending everything was fine. That's not one bad decision. That's 100 small ones, each one making the next one easier. I'm not saying I was perfect through any of this. I wasn't. I deferred too easily. I accepted I'll send the number soon too many times. I told myself that Ethan knowing the bakery better meant I should stay out of it, and what I was actually doing was avoiding the discomfort of asserting myself. Intelligence isn't just knowing things. It's knowing when to ask the question you've been putting off, when to push back on the answer that's too vague, when to call the person who texted you a warning instead of walking out the door anyway. Sandra texted me in time. But I also picked up the phone. I want to remember that part too. What I keep coming back to is this. The bakery is still standing because my dad built it on something real. 32 years of early mornings and honest work and a recipe for apple fritters written on the back of a church bulletin. That foundation held even when someone tried to hollow it out from the inside. And I think that's true of most things worth keeping. The integrity of what you build determines what survives when someone tries to take it apart. June told me once, a few weeks after everything settled, that the staff had known something was wrong since October. They'd felt the shift. They didn't know what it was, but they knew. And they kept showing up anyway, kept doing their jobs, kept the cases stocked, and the ovens running, because that's what you do when you care about something more than you care about the uncertainty surrounding it. I think that's what resilience actually looks like. Not the dramatic version, just people showing up, doing the work, waiting for the truth to catch up. I don't know what happens to Ethan. I've stopped trying to predict it. What I know is that the recipe binder is back where it belongs. June has a title that matches what she was already doing. And when I sit at that corner table and drink my coffee, it feels like something that was almost lost was held onto by the thinnest margin. I'll take that. I'll take it and I'll be careful with it.